Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C. on a chilly early spring afternoon with the pleasure of talking to Mike Austin, co-editor of a relatively recent book, QAnon and the Cross. I'm sorry, Mike, I'm already mangling the name
Oh,
of the
that's
book.
all
Why
right.
don't you hold it up for us?
Yeah, you bet. It's QAnon, Chaos and the Cross, Christianity and Conspiracy Theories.
So, a very timely topic with a number of very insightful contributors. And Mike, you teach at,
Yeah, I teach philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University, public university near Lexington.
and just out of curiosity, what is your religious tradition?
Yeah, so it's a mix. I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, then sort of became an evangelical without knowing it when I was a senior in high school. So I still think of myself as an evangelical in kind of the classic theological sense of that term.
Someone told me they thought maybe you were theologically Wesleyan. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it depends on the day. I'm part of
Okay.
a Presbyterian church, but yeah, I'm still sort of working through a lot of those questions. But yeah, I think, and broadly speaking, I would align there in many ways.
The contributors to your book are all evangelical. Is that correct?
No, there's kind of a wide variety. So there are definitely evangelical scholars. There are, I think, Roman Catholic. They're mainline. Yeah, so kind of a variety, but all in some from just some Christian tradition.
So, the influence of conspiracy theories and conspiracism among Christians, obviously, it's become very strong in recent years. How do you explain it, and what specifically motivated you to put this book together?
Yeah, so let's take the second question first. The motivation was actually was a friend of mine. He'd been approached by a publisher to write like a single authored book about this, and he referred them to me. And I just thought, I'm not ready to write a whole book myself. Like I actually wanted to learn, and so a great way to learn is to bring together a bunch of people who can bring their particular expertise. And so the motivation, my co-editor Greg Bach, he had done a lot of work already in this, and so we just talked about writing a book or editing, and we thought editing would be good in the sense that we've got people from his, Christian scholars from history, theology, biblical studies, philosophy, and so bringing their own particular expertise to it. I think it works in a for what it is as a resource for people to kind of think through. And it's the kind of book you wouldn't necessarily give to a family member or friend who's maybe knee deep in a conspiracy theory. It's more for people who are, you know, who have a family member or friend who just want to learn and have concerns and wonder kind of the questions you just asked, like why is it prevalent? What can be done? What is a conspiracy theory? Those basic questions. So yeah, that was kind of the motivation behind it. And then the prevalence, that's a hard question. I think, there's some general trends in the United States that are reflected sometimes more, maybe more strongly within Christian traditions. There's a general distrust of science and more broadly of kind of intellectual authorities. I saw it was a 2019 survey that said roughly 35% of Americans are like trust science, broadly speaking. And that was before COVID. So it wouldn't be surprising if it has fallen. So I think there's some of that distrust of institutions and of people who are, I mean, yeah, people like that do work in the knowledge realm, faculty and researchers. And so it's kind of an American thing too, right? Just to sort of the distrust of those who are, yeah, those kind of institutions, skepticism about uh, knowledge and those who, you know, are authorities or put themselves forward as authorities. So those are some of the things. I think there are a lot of other reasons that come in there, psychological reasons, probably sometimes moral reasons, not in the sense of like people are immoral, so they believe conspiracy theories, but like my own view, I think like a central part of Christian ethics is character and human flourishing, and those things are vital for fulfillment in life. And so I think there's a lack of maybe the search for meaning that we're all on, and conspiracy theories are an easy way to get some of those, be a part of something larger than yourself. Being in the know kind of appeals to maybe some of our lesser angels at times. Those are some of the things that jump to mind.
Now, you would think for Christians who ostensibly find their chief meaning in Jesus Christ and who believe in divine sovereignty would be the least susceptible to conspiracy theories, but perhaps they become even more susceptible to conspiracy theories, maybe than the general population. Am I exaggerating?
Yeah, that's a good question. There definitely is. I was looking at some statistics earlier today again. It does look like compared to other members of society. So, for example, 55% of white evangelicals believe in some sense, the activity of the deep state that was working against the Trump administration. This was the first administration. Um, 20, yeah, I mean, it does go white mainline Protestants. I mean, it's still numbers. So here's another one. I'll just give another example. One of the QAnon conspiracy theories that Trump is secretly battling a group of pedophiles, and Democrats in the media. 27% of white evangelicals believe that, 15% of white mainline Protestants, 11% of Hispanic Catholics, and 7% of Black Protestants. So those they're not alarming, but I think they're relatively more than other, non-religious groups. And it does tend to skew, or it doesn't necessarily really the difference between, say, politically, someone who's on the left or the right, it's not so much whether or not you believe in conspiracy theories, it's which ones you believe is what's interesting. And there's not really a differentiation in terms of, for example, for education, right? Education, economic status, it doesn't look like, I mean, someone like me who's more skeptical of a lot of these conspiracy theories, it's easy to think, well, people just aren't educated, but that's not true. It can be I mean, there's no difference there. So something else is going on. Yeah.
So for white evangelicals, obviously they would see secular elites of the left as adversarial and at work to undermine Christian influence in society. So that would open them up to conspiracy theories, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you can see that. I think in my own experience, so in the late 1980s, and so being an evangelical in college and working some in campus ministry after that, and there definitely was at that time, and it's still there today. There was in those circles like a skepticism about science, that sort of belief in evolution or naturalistic evolution, right? That there's something fishy going on there, right? And so even though that's what the sort of scientific authorities would teach at a university and believe, seeing that as conflicting with the Bible, and maybe a mistrust, like you said, of government, and especially the past, even then, but probably more so, right, in the past 20 years of people using governmental and other kinds of power in certain ways to maybe enforce what people would see as a non-Christian, or even views about human nature, about society, they would think is hostile to Christianity. So I think there's that kind of distrust, maybe in some cases merited, in some cases not, kind of opens us up maybe to these kind of theories seeming more plausible.
You think perspectives rooted in conspiracism are intrinsically at odds with an orthodox Christian perspective?
Yes. So I guess I would want to, those that are false, right? So it's sort of that's an important thing. And so I mean, there are conspiracies, right? There are conspiracies that happen. There were, you think of in history, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in some sense, part of a conspiracy to assassinate or at least upend Hitler's rule. Watergate was an actual conspiracy. So I think we want to be careful. One of the things I think is important is humility on either side. So for people who maybe are more prone to believe in a conspiracy theory, the humility of, it's hard to, you don't, we're not in the position to know as much as we want to know often about some of these things. Even if a good case, if a shiny case can be made online, by someone who is persuasive. And then there's the humility of maybe those of us who are skeptical to not just have disdain for or discount people's belief in them as just, well, if you believe any conspiracy theory, then you're just not being reasonable, because there are cases where they're true. What I think is important, and from kind of the quote that you mentioned, is, yeah, the tendency to go to conspiracy first, just given that the vast majority of these are false, or at least haven't been demonstrated to be true, especially these days where they proliferate online and on social media. Christians, regardless of what tradition we're in, are supposed to be people committed to the truth, and ultimately that truth is a person, Jesus Christ. But more broadly than that, just we're supposed to be people of the truth. And if we are susceptible to easy deception that can happen in these kind of things, and really a lot of conspiracy theories for Christians, it ends up being gossip and slander, right? Claims about people that are false or at least unsubstantiated. And so in those ways, right, it undercuts things we should be committed to in our daily lives.
So can there be some distinction between the plots that you described, Watergate, the plot to overthrow Hitler, a circumscribed number of people across a certain amount of time that's documented, and we know the names of the people involved. But the more extravagant conspiracy theories seem to involve or would have to entail, are often thousands of people across many, many years, perhaps decades and generations, and assume that none of these people have ever broken their silence and somehow have supernaturally maintained the conspiracy that can't really be effectively uncovered. You just have to believe in it by faith. So would you make that kind of distinction?
Yeah, I think that's important. And I don't know if it's in his chapter or just conversation, but Drew Johnson, one of the contributors to the book, he's a biblical scholar now, but he was involved in the armed forces and I think in military intelligence. And so one of the reasons he gives for disbelief in a lot of these kind of broad theories like you talk about is he just can't imagine that many people in the government doing something that's coordinated and keeping it secret for that long. And I think that makes sense, right? So I think that is a key difference, right? I mean, there have been. I was looking up. You think of the African National Congress as another actual conspiracy to end the apartheid regime, and really, one interesting thing. Well, no, I guess I won't say that. That doesn't really fit. But so yeah, I think that's important. It's one thing to identify a group of people. Most actual conspiracies that exist, they tend to be relatively smaller group of people, as you mentioned. So QAnon, to believe a lot of these theories that are put forward, you've got to believe, like you said, hundreds or thousands of people working in concert, keeping something secret, and it's that strains credulity, absent publicly verifiable evidence that it's going on.
When I think of the conspiracy perspective, often comes to mind David Ray Griffin, if you remember him, who headed the Center for Process Studies out in California and was a leading proponent of 9/11 conspiracy theories that strike in the Pentagon and the World Trade Center were government orchestrated controlled demolition, which obviously would have entailed thousands of people in federal and local government. And it very much was in sync with process theology, which thinks that there is really no final judgment, just there's a constant God at work and constant forces of evil eternally at odds with each other. So the evil can just continue indefinitely, which to my mind is definitely at odds with a more orthodox Christian perspective. So often I have likened the conspiracy perspective to process theology, but others have pushed back on that. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I would agree. It just, for me, that's outside of orthodoxy. And it doesn't, I mean, it seems to, it kind of strains on sort of this conception of God that I think has been understood and developed both from the scriptures and a couple thousand years of theology across traditions. So there is some, I mean, I think I guess what's the connection there that you see maybe between process, maybe more explicitly between process theology and conspiracism? Is it just the ongoing, never ending?
As I understand process theology, God is not supreme.
Mm-hmm.
God is himself a process constantly unfolding. And so from the process theology perspective, for example, there's no final judgment. Evil is never defeated. Evil is not finite or under God's jurisdiction. Evil just constantly reinvents itself and moves forward. So from that perspective, you can have these conspiracies that last for decades. David Ray Griffin, for example, believed that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy by the FDR administration and would connect that to the events of 9/11 across 80 years. So it really takes a great and deep faith to tie everything together in a neat package.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I can see that connection. Just yeah, maybe it gives more power in a certain sense to evil to
Yes.
exist and manifest and sustain itself over long periods of time. Um,
And I think Christians should agree that even evil people are finite and make mistakes and don't have it all together. And spiritually, we can have confidence that their plans will be stymied in the end. They don't just
mhm.
go on forever.
Right. Well, and there's even in the worst of us, right? There's still that image bearer of God. So
Yes,
uh,
yes.
yeah, thankfully,
Yeah, right. Even the evil are kept back by divine grace.
that's right. Yeah.
So, advice or guidance you have for Christians who are struggling with their own viewpoints on conspiracy theories or have family members and close friends who are very enmeshed in conspiracy theories, what counsel do you offer as they contend with those challenges?
Yeah, it's so difficult. I think the question you asked is the right one, right? We shouldn't be concerned with trying to have, debates online with people who are proponents of conspiracy theories that we don't know or barely know, right? But I think we have to, there's kind of two tracks. One, within our religious communities, our churches, and this is kind of central to a lot of the issues that we face these days, is a refocus on whether depending on your tradition, whether it's discipleship or spiritual formation, character growth, all those sorts of things, both intellectual and moral. I think that's what C.S. Lewis called becoming little Christs, right? That's the chief task of the Christian. So I think a lot of that formation in the long run is the best antidote to the draw to false conspiracy theories. Um, Relationally, I mean, yeah, you have to like I would be much more open and willing to spend the time it would take with a friend or family member or the person sitting next to me in the pew at church to start engaging these things. And so I think you have to, if you're going to do that, right, try to keep the conversation focused. Maybe just say, tell me, give me one thing, like give me one article, one video that you find really that persuasive, your family member, friend who's into the theory, and then you watch it, you read it, you get together and discuss it, you ask questions, um, and then maybe the deal is you'll give them one thing to read or think about, either criticizing that or kind of response or general concerns about conspiracy theory. So I think those longer term, slow discussions grounded in friendship and love. Now, there may be times where you just can't do that. I mean, some people just can't if you can't agree on the foundational rules of just a good discussion and dialogue, then it's not going to be helpful. And in those cases, it's more of a matter for prayer, just loving them consistently. And maybe there may be times where you just say, I don't, let's just not talk about this. Let's, do something else, go fishing together or have coffee and, just cultivate the friendship and the relationship. But I think, yeah, I guess I still have faith, kind of what we just talked about, that image of God in us, that God is the one, in Isaiah that says, come, let us reason together. And so if we can do that, from a humble and loving posture, I think over time you can see progress. And good. I have a friend who from church who was kind of during COVID went down into some of these QAnon rabbit holes, and he attributes just the love and patience of his wife for helping him get out. I mean, some of it was discussions, I think, about the actual issues, but it was more about that faithful, loving presence. So I think those things matter.
In terms of how conspiracy theories became more popular, obviously the internet played a major role in that, and the pandemic amplified with people staying at home, lots of downtime online, looking for explanations, going down these endless rabbit holes. Has there been some recovery from 2020, or were those
Yeah,
still ingrained?
that's a good question. I haven't seen recent data. Um, like I know that American Enterprise Institute has some research on this. Lifeway did some. So yeah, it's be a good question of whether it's gone down. I think I would say, generally speaking, without numbers, like when we did this book, we thought, well, maybe in a few years there won't be a need for it. But it seems like these things they're persisting. Um, so But I haven't. I mean, I think during the run up to the election, there was still discussion of conspiracy theories. You see people talking about January 6th, as an FBI, or a government orchestrated, all those kind of things. So I think you still see the theories floated a lot. That's just seems to be a human nature thing. In terms of the percentages, that would be interesting. My guess would be it's gone down a little bit, but not a lot.
No, I think you're as I am, you're old enough to remember when dispensationalism was very popular among evangelicals with a strong focus on the end times and trying to connect
Hmm.
current events with the apocalypse. And that perspective seemed to be conducive to conspiracy theories for many people. And yet now, as dispensationalism has largely faded, conspiracy theories, in some sense, have almost replace the dispensationalist perspective, which at least was striving to understand scripture and striving to focus on Christ, whereas the conspiracy theories seem to take people in very different places.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting and in many ways tragic about them. And one of the chapters discuss this. A lot of the language, conspiracy theories of QAnon mirrors a lot of Christian language. So it's like these grand battles of good versus evil, spiritual warfare, some of that language. So it's kind of borrows some of the concepts and language that would be familiar to many Christians, even evangelicals who maybe were, like thinking about the end times and dispensationalism. So it still captures some of those ideas and just recast them in this other sort of grand battle. But yeah, I think that's interesting. The Left Behind series, those kind of things that were so prominent and shape people's views, not really grounded in necessarily scripture, but yeah, when you think that there's going to be an antichrist and the world, it's going to be some political, I remember when people said it was the Pope or it was Gorbachev or Obama. I mean, there's always somebody to take that mantle in people's imaginations. Yeah.
Well, the conspiracy theories give people a sense of drama and excitement in their lives that
Hmm.
otherwise lacking. And ideally, the gospel itself should provide that drama, but if
Yeah.
people look elsewhere.
Yeah. It's something that the things that I care most about in my sort of writing and research and speaking are related to character development and spiritual formation. So I think about I mean, if you want drama and meaning, you know, devoting your life to pursuing a deeper union with God in Christ, deeper connections with people in your church community, your family, your friends, and then trying to become a person of love, courage, humility, patience. I mean, there's plenty to do. Um, and I think I have, especially I think of like younger men in our society and in our churches who, I mean, in my own church, asking me about Jordan Peterson and about Joe Rogan and kind of the sources they go to. I can't remember the guy's name. He was like a former Navy SEAL, basically says, do hard things, challenge yourself. And so I think there's something in us that wants that challenge. And I think, Christian faith gives us that. It just looks very different. And I think pursuing meaning in these other ways is because we're not, for whatever reason, sometimes that message isn't getting through, or we're not just committing ourselves to, as you mentioned, the gospel and Christian growth and those kind of things. So my hope is that, yeah, we could find the depth in our faith that where these things that maybe lead us to believe conspiracy theories, or there's all such other ways we can go wrong apart from conspiracy theories, finding maybe depending on politics too much to get meaning or entertainment or just whatever it is, that there's this core part of who we are that we're never going to be satisfied at that in that deeper way apart from Christ. But yeah, it's concerning.
Many pastors have struggled to deal with the conspiracy perspective of their congregations. Have you heard many stories or have pastors reported back to you that your book has been helpful to them?
Yeah, I've had some like use it and discuss it some. I'm trying to think of specific cases. I mean, there was, the survey, I think this was before the book was published, Lifeway, that roughly 50% of Protestant pastors had regularly heard, or at least members of their congregation refer to conspiracy theories as an explanation of current events. So they're dealing with it. I've heard more, I think I get more of the negative stories, about someone who a family member who doesn't even people will leave a church if the pastor doesn't kind of give voice to their conspiracy theory that they because they feel it so deeply, right? They have this deep subjective conviction that this is true and there's this good and evil stuff going on. So of course, as Christians, we should care about those things. So I think it's really difficult for, I mean, obviously to be a pastor generally, but be a pastor or a priest and dealing with that stuff, dealing with the political, all the different polarizations. This is just one manifestation of it.
And do you think many pastors themselves have fallen for conspiracy theories? Are there any surveys, or do you have anecdotal information?
Yeah, I mean, you can see I have anecdotal information. That's the kind of thing that you get when you discuss these things or write a book or give a talk. There definitely are pastors who make use of this, and those videos end up popping up on my feed or get sent to me. So definitely are pastors. There was, I mean, I think I mentioned this guy in the book. Now I'm losing his name. He's in Tennessee, but he was just constantly espousing QAnon theories, and you'll see pastors do that here and there. And so that's also really because that's a responsibility. Obviously, pastors have to shepherd, to care for people, to nurture them in their pursuit of the truth and of their faith. And yeah, and really, when a whole local church heads that direction, yeah, that I would say undermines the core mission of loving God, loving your neighbors yourself, also furthering the gospel, serving the community. And that's what I think is difficult. Is the conspiracy theory can become it has that power to become an obsession where you talk to a Christian who wants to talk more about their conspiracy theory that they believe in than Christ or the gospel or the kingdom of God. So it can become a certain, yet another kind of idolatry almost. It doesn't seem that way because it's couched in spiritual language, good versus evil. But if my heart and mind are more consumed with a conspiracy theory than these other things of the kingdom, that's another problem as well. And so if a pastor's fostering that, yeah, that's really bad.
Contributors to your book include evangelicals and Catholics. Is there a unique Catholic perspective on this topic?
That's a good question. I don't think, at least not in the book. I mean, I think historically, right, there are people who have conspiracy theories about Catholics, right? And then historically, the Christian church has had both Catholic and Protestant engaged in conspiratorial thinking about like the Jewish people, for example. But I wouldn't say there's any that I can think of that uniquely Catholic predisposition, or I mean, maybe the Catholic approach just can bring in not just scripture, but of course the church tradition as well, and church thinkers in the past to counteract it in ways that, I mean, that especially American evangelical Protestants don't, they tend to be less tradition oriented in those ways. So not drawing from, they don't have as much of a wealth of theological tradition, or it's there, I mean, fewer years, but they just don't make use of it as much. It's kind of a bias of the contemporary, so to speak.
And to what extent does conspiracism overlap with anti-Semitism?
Mm. Yeah, so that is mentioned some in the text, and there have been times in the past where well, we see that now too. I mean, I think there's a rise in anti-Semitism in terms of both online chatter and kind of becoming more visible in our nation the past few years. Recently discussing or having a discussion with some Jewish thinkers and scholars about this who track this kind of thing. So there's been an anti-Semitism in conspiracism, sort of as a group of people that have been the target of that kind of thinking, right? That when we hear this World War, Nazi Germany, you hear people say today, right, that the Jews are controlling the media or the financial sector or all these different things. So yeah, that's again not publicly available evidence for it, but it's for whatever reason, definitely a phenomenon that occurs.
And succinctly, how would you explain why conspiracism often overlaps with anti-Semitism? Is it the centrality of the Jews in the salvation story that elevates their importance, or
Mm,
coming from?
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I wonder, historically that could be part of it, and when people sort of say things like the Jews killed Jesus, right? They're the ones that crucified Jesus. So you've got that historical sort of anti-Semitism, and then it can bleed over into, I mean, if you're anti-Semitic and you want, for whatever reason, right, you have this a negative view of the Jewish people, that they're evil or that they're up to something, it becomes fertile ground to start growing conspiracy theories that fit into that view. So yeah, I think it is just the historical oppression, but also sort of the opposition that just the Jewish people have faced for centuries, and so it makes them yet another, maybe a prime target for some people to develop these kinds of theories.
Mike, remind me how we're doing on time. Are we approaching the magic?
We are, yes, we're getting near the end of it. So
if you were doing this book now as opposed to 2 and 3 years ago, what would you add? What did you overlook that's still very relevant, or maybe has become relevant even since several years ago?
yeah, that's a good question. I think I would try to, like, we were pretty open and just let contributors do whatever they wanted. I think I would try to add more specific cases. So what, like 9/11, I might like have people examine particular conspiracy theories that people have put forth, or the conspiracies about January 6, 2021, right? Some of those things. So just because I think one thing that could be helpful is to give examples of someone analyzing particular conspiracy theories and then uncovering the flaws and the falsehoods, and there might be some ways, some lessons to draw from that, like a framework that you could apply to others in the future. And there's some of that in the book, but I think it would be good to have more of that, because it would be give people like a model for how to evaluate these things. We do some of that in the book, and we give some models of how to have a conversation with somebody who's knee deep in these things, which is helpful. But I think that's what jumps to mind to me.
Mike Austin, co-editor of QAnon, Chaos and the Cross, Christianity and Conspiracies. Thank you very much for an insightful conversation. And if you would hold your book up one more time.
You bet. Get it right here.
And I commend that to our listeners. Thank you again, Mike.
Thank you.